So the other thing that ancient Egyptians used often to protect tombs was magic, right? That's the fundamental ideas of their religion. And the curses on tombs come in a variety of different levels. So sometimes they can be very soft or gentle, like if you do something bad, God will judge you in the afterlife. I'm sure that any, nefarious tomb robber wouldn't have taken that to heart too much or already knew that before he entered the tomb.
The average ancient Egyptian did not find tomb curses to be, a deterrent. Because first of all, we don't have many curses that have been preserved. And second of all, they're still being robbed.
Clearly the benefits outweighed the potential threats, even in the afterlife. And we have to remember that not all Egyptians believed in an afterlife. We do have texts that show that there was, some people who were pessimistic and who questioned, was there actually an afterlife?
Tomb curses were certainly utilized more with a wish than a belief. I don't think there's much question about that. In fact, most of the tomb curses we have, come from the Old Kingdom, and they stopped doing them.
So when we get into things like Tutankhamun's tomb, right? Everybody thinks that there was a curse on King Tut's tomb, but there wasn't. What we do have is within the burial chamber, you have these 4 things called the protective magical bricks, and they go in the 4 corners, the north, the south, the east, and the west, and essentially they're a magical spell that generically protect from anything bad happening from the 4 cardinal directions. But there's no or else clause, right? So what does actually protect these tombs? So unfortunately, they did not have the booby traps or giant rolling boulders that you see in Indiana Jones. I know I want them to be real. You want them to be real. They are not real. But what they do have is still very cool. What they have are giant stone blocks called portcullis stones. And these are made of very hard stone. So essentially, they're giant plugs that are not meant to be moved by anybody. And honestly, no normal person can move one of those stones. Those stones need to be moved by stonemasons who have real knowledge of how to cut into them. Not just anybody can break into this. The coolest tomb to ever try to protect against tomb robbing is the tomb of Senwosret III at Abydos. And this thing's amazing because Senwosret III basically reconceptualized the entire tomb to try to protect it. So the first thing that he did was he moved his tomb back to Abydos, a place where kings hadn't been buried for 1,000 years, hundreds of miles away from where the modern kings are being buried. So nobody would ever expect that he was actually buried there, right? So the next thing that he does is that he abandons the pyramid, because a pyramid is a giant marker of where your tomb is. And instead, he's buried within a mountain where the mountain manages to act like the pyramidal symbol. And the entrance into his tomb was through about 40 feet of loose sand. So in order to get to the entrance, you have to move all this sand. And that is a giant sand moving operation that leaves a massive hole over several, weeks, if not months, that somebody in the town is supposed to see. Even once you find the entrance to the tomb, there are 2 passageways that are about 8 feet wide square each that kind of lead into each other. And even then you get into the inside where you have your small pole vault chamber with 3 little rooms. And you think, oh, well, this is it, right? No. That's where you get the next portcullis stone hidden in the ceiling that you can't see. So you have to remove the veneer, find a giant granite portcullis stone, get your stonemasons to take that out. At that point, you can then go down the chamber where there is a massive drop, 15 meters straight down, again, needing to move sand or getting a giant ladder. And at the bottom of the pit, that's where your hidden door is. And then you go 15 meters straight up again to find the next hidden entrance within the tomb itself, again behind veneer. So the tomb robbers, once they get to this location, they see this massive portcullis stone hidden in the top. They had removed the veneer, but then they saw that it wasn't just one. It was in fact a series of 9. So it was easier instead of moving each of these 9, to dig an opposite tunnel that kind of follows around through the limestone to get into the next passage. Once they get into the next passage, you then have this incredibly long, curving chamber that goes through the mountainside. So they ran down to the end of that where there was nothing. And so they start ripping out all the walls again, taking off the veneer again. Like, where's the next hidden block? Where is it? Where is it? They can't find it. So they move backwards, and they move backwards, and they move backwards for all of that length and massive amount of stone veneer removed until finally they found Senwosret III's sarcophagus halfway in the middle of this chamber, right on the other side of the 9 block stones. And even his particular sarcophagus managed to have this last locking mechanism that they had to break open. And yet they still managed to do it. His tomb was robbed within 100 to 150 years during the Second Intermediate Period. But you have to imagine the amount of people, the amount of labor that went into this. This isn't just a couple of guys. This is the local administration bringing in workforces specifically to be able to rob this tomb. Nobody else would have been able to do it.
The New Kingdom was a period where Egypt is forging an enormous empire. And that's an empire to the south in Nubia and to the north in the Levant. And it is the period of Egypt's greatest wealth. So the kings of the New Kingdom were as wealthy as the Egyptians ever were.
The kings of the New Kingdom did have very rich burials. The sad thing is that we simply don't have the burial goods, that they were robbed in antiquity. They've been robbed they were probably robbed for centuries. So simply by the size, the sheer magnitude of these tombs, they must have been absolutely splendid.
So then we move into the New Kingdom, right? This is the time of empire, and it's the time of most of the pharaohs that you've heard of, people like Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun, Ramses the Great. And these guys are all buried in the Valley of the Kings. And the pharaohs who created the initial Valley of the Kings, either Amenhotep I or Tutmosis I, somebody in there, reconceptualized this place to be a totally hidden cemetery. And it wasn't just the cemetery. Their entire town of craftsmen, the people at Deir el-Medina, were supposed to be hidden. The problem is you can't actually hide all that. I mean, the Valley of the Kings is in Thebes. It's a major city. This type of secret cannot be kept, right? And then the one thing that I cannot explain is that they decided to change the actual effective mechanism that was protecting them. They decided to stop using these giant portcullis stones and instead use mud brick and gravel, which I could probably take out given a shovel and enough time. And that changes the scale of tomb robbing inevitably, right? You no longer need hundreds or dozens of people with specialized knowledge. No, instead, a group of 5 to 10 guys could do this on their own at night with a couple of shovels. What ends up happening are small groups of people actually end up making this a side hustle. And we have these really cool judicial records called the Tomb Robbery Papyri that actually give us details about some of these guys and what they're doing. And they'll say things like, we go out as a regular habit to actually dig into the tombs. And one of these particular stories end up telling us that in order to get all of the metal and semi-precious stones that are physically wrapped into a mummy, one of the things that they do is they light the mummy on fire so that they can then loosen all this stuff and grab it quickly. The problem is that when you light a mummy on fire, you are destroying the afterlife of the deceased. So these guys are no longer on trial for theft or destruction of property or breaking and entering. No, they're on trial for murder. And if it's a king, they're on trial for regicide.
If your body is destroyed and your name is destroyed, that's pretty bad for the deceased. That's why a lot of times tombs had images, had statues of themselves, had their names everywhere. So let's say something does happen to your body, right? Okay, well, you can still live on because there's this image of you somewhere. Your name is still somewhere.
It's probably not fair that the objects from Tutankhamun have totally overshadowed other tomb discoveries. But it's impossible not to acknowledge that we've learned more from that one nearly intact tomb than we've learned from all the other tombs in terms of goods, probably all put together. I don't think that we would be nearly as knowledgeable about what the Egyptians did produce for the burial of a ruler if we didn't have the Tomb of Tut. So it's hard not to give it its due.
When Carter found the tomb in November 1922, the tomb was not untouched. Basically, it had been robbed twice, probably during the reign of Horemheb. And what's interesting is that they only got into the antechamber, the first chamber. They did not get into the burial chamber, nor did they get into the treasury, which was off of the burial chamber. And you even find objects that they let go, in the corridor on the way out of the tomb, which makes us think that they were discovered by police that happened to be policing the King's Valley.
A lot of his boxes have all of their locks broken off of them. If you look at his bow and arrow set, there seem to be like dirty footprints actually walking up the side of it. All of his jars have been unstopped and looked into. And even his famous golden throne that had gold leaf foil on it, the bottom fretwork was ripped out. But if you compare the antechamber to the treasury, you see the treasury, it's full, but it's nice and neat. That room was never broken into.
He had umbrellas, he had gloves, he had socks. These are things that we don't get in other burials. We might get them ripped up and maybe guess what they are. And then in addition, just to visit and see what Carter saw when he first opened there, and the oars for the boat that carries him across the sky are laid out in a ritual pattern on the floor. This is untouched, right? So there's just, you could go on and on all day long with Tutankhamun, I'm afraid.
The fortunate thing is that Tutankhamun was so insignificant that at some level he was actually forgotten about. That information security wasn't as much of a problem for him. And when we get to 150 to 200 years later, when we have Ramses VI's tomb, Ramses VI then decides to build his tomb just above Tut's tomb in the same mountainside. And so as they're hewing out the tomb and taking all the stone out, they're just throwing it on top of Tut's, further burying him below, where he then actually did lay hidden until 1922.
Was Tutankhamun's tomb richer or less rich than other kings of the 18th dynasty? Now, we know the 18th dynasty was their empire building time. These are incredibly wealthy pharaohs. If we did have one more earlier tomb that was near intact, we could judge what we don't have.
So you might think that, based on these stories, that there were no honest officials in ancient Egypt, but that is not true. Actually, most of them, a lot of them, must have been honest. And at the very end of the New Kingdom, beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, the priesthood of Amun has essentially taken over the city. And there's one guy by the name of Penegem II who decides that this is too much. So Penegem II realizes that he cannot protect the actual tombs of the kings, but he still wants to protect their afterlives. So what he does is he takes a small group of people in the dead of night, he opens up the individual tombs, which he had records for because he's in charge, and he takes out the actual bodies of the pharaohs, and he removes all the bodies and moves them around to the other side of the hill and buries them in an actual secret tomb that later ended up being called the Deir el-Bahri Cache. In 1881, this Deir el-Bahri Cache was eventually found. The Egyptians actually made a movie about it in 1969 called El Mumia, The Night of the Counting of the Years. It was found by a specific family that then decided to take things slowly out of the tomb and sell them. And the local officials realized that somebody had found something really special. Somebody had found a tomb that was connected to the actual pharaohs. And eventually, what ends up happening is the officials find the tomb. They manage to take out the objects and bring it all to Cairo to put inside the museum. That's why when you go into the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization today, you can actually look at Ramses the Great. You can look at Tutmosis III, and you can see the glory of the past. We have all of their irreplaceable knowledge because the officials today protected it.